What if I told you two college cynics named their band after a sex toy from a William Burroughs novel, then became the most obsessive perfectionists in rock history? They fired legendary guitarists after single takes, quit touring at their peak. One lost his girlfriend to tragedy, got sued for millions, then hit by a taxi, all while recording one cursed album. Their masterpiece used 42 musicians and nearly destroyed them. This is Steely Dan, too smart for their own good. The story of Steely Dan doesn't start in some sweaty rock club or a garage in suburbia. It starts in the Ivory Tower, Bard College, a progressive institution in upstate New York known for attracting intellectuals, countercultural types, and what one observer called blue-blooded rich kids. This was 1967, and among the student body were two young men who would change the sound of American music forever: Walter Becker and Donald Fagen. Their connection was immediate and profound. Fagen, a New Jersey native studying literature, first heard Becker playing electric blues guitar and was struck by something different. Unlike the other college kids with their trebly, surfadelic white guy sound, Becker played with an authentic blues touch, sophisticated, raw, and real. They bonded over shared obsessions that set them apart from their peers: dark humor, black comedy, science fiction, the cerebral rock of Frank Zappa, and most importantly, high-level jazz, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, the kind of music that required you to think while you listened. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. But here's what really defined them: a mutual disdain for the conventions of contemporary pop music. They looked at the rock scene of the late 60s, all peace, love, and authenticity, and saw through it. They were cynics in an age of optimists, intellectuals, in a world that celebrated raw emotion over craft. The name they eventually chose for their band said everything about their worldview. Steely Dan came from William Burroughs' nightmarish novel, Naked Lunch. It was the name of a sexual device. Most bands in 1971 were naming themselves after animals or dreams or feelings. Becker and Fagen named themselves after something shocking and absurd, immediately signaling they were detached, cynical observers of the human condition. Their apprenticeship in the machinery of commercial music proved essential. After relocating to California with producer Gary Katz, they served as staff songwriters, learning the craft of accessible pop composition. They mastered the 3-minute single, the infectious hook, the radio-friendly arrangement. But make no mistake, they weren't selling out. They were learning the rules so they could break them later. This was the key to their genius. They understood that to deliver what Becker called finely polished pulp stories, etched with disconnected imagery, they needed to master the mainstream first. Complex jazz chords wrapped in simple, infectious melodies. Sophisticated arrangements disguised as pop songs. By the time they secretly assembled their first 6-piece band in the basement of the Dunhill offices in 1971, they were ready to prove that smart guys could make hit records, ready to challenge every assumption about what rock music could be. When Can't Buy a Thrill hit record stores in 1972, it sounded like the work of a band that had arrived fully formed, and in many ways, they had. The album was an instant critical and commercial success, climbing to number 17 on the Billboard chart and spawning 2 major hits: Do It Again, which reached number 6, and Reelin' in the Years, which peaked at number 11. But listen closely to that debut album, and you hear the tension already brewing. Multiple lead vocalists, David Palmer, Jim Hodder, and Fagen, sharing duties because the band was still trying to figure out its identity. Becker and Fagen were the brains, the writers, the visionaries. But they were trapped in the traditional rock band structure with other members who had their own ideas. The cracks became visible with their second album, Countdown to Ecstasy, released in 1973. Critics loved it. The compositions were more complex, the arrangements more sophisticated, the lyrics darker and more oblique. But commercially, it was a disappointment. The album stalled at number 35. The singles Showbiz Kids and My Old School barely cracked the top 100. This was the paradox at the heart of Steely Dan. The smarter they got, the more musically challenging their compositions became, the less the mass market wanted to hear them. And the experience of touring, of being a traditional rock band, was making everything worse. The road in the early 1970s was brutal. They found themselves opening for heavy metal acts, playing to audiences who wanted volume and spectacle, not intricate jazz rock fusion. The sound quality was terrible. The audiences were hostile. For two intellectual perfectionists like Becker and Fagen, it was torture. The breaking point came during a New York show around 1974 where they opened for Electric Light Orchestra. The set was a disaster, marred by sound problems that Becker and Fagen thought were deliberately done by ELO's sound crew. That incident crystallized everything they hated about the traditional rock and roll lifestyle: the chaos, the lack of control, the impossibility of achieving the sonic perfection they heard in their heads when they were at the mercy of venue acoustics and hostile opening slots. So they made a radical decision that would define the rest of their career. They quit touring, just walked away from the road entirely in 1974, right as they were building momentum. It was controversial, even shocking. Bands toured, that's what you did. But Becker and Fagen decided their art could only be realized through complete, centralized control in the studio. They weren't a band anymore. They were a musical concept, a recording project, a laboratory for sonic experimentation. Free from the obligations of maintaining a touring lineup, Becker and Fagen transformed Steely Dan into something unprecedented. A studio dictatorship where they could, as they put it, hire anyone we wanted from any discipline. The best session players in Los Angeles, jazz legends, guitar virtuosos, anyone who could help them achieve the sound in their heads. The methodology was obsessive, expensive, and emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. Elliot Shiner, the engineer who worked on their 1977 masterpiece Asia, described the process simply: every track, every overdub had to be the perfect overdub. Guitarist Steve Kahn, who played rhythm guitar on Peg, characterized the environment more bluntly. Having the money and the power of guaranteed sales, he said, is a license for abuse. The endless takes, the rejection of performances that anyone else would consider excellent, the emotional toll of working for two men who simply could not be satisfied. But here's what critics often miss when they call Steely Dan's music clinical or cold. Becker and Fagen weren't chasing mechanical perfection for its own sake. They were chasing something deeper, arrangements that were tight and songs that could make it swing. One session musician later noted that they would often work past the perfection point until it became natural, until it sounded almost improvised. This approach reached its absolute zenith with Asia in 1977. The album was a commercial and critical triumph, a monument to sonic perfectionism. Peg reached number 11 on the Billboard chart, proof they could still craft infectious hooks while working at this elevated level of complexity. The respect from their peers said everything. When legendary Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page was asked about his favorite guitar solo of all time, he didn't choose one of his own. He chose Elliot Randall's solo on Steely Dan's Reelin' in the Years. Coming from one of rock's immortal guitar heroes, that endorsement carried weight. But there's a darker truth beneath the immaculate production. Becker and Fagen, famous for their cynical outlook, filled their songs with burnouts, drug dealers, and two-bit heroes trapped in what one observer called the sour end of the emotional spectrum. The more chaotic and morally ambiguous the lyrics, the more controlled and technically impeccable the arrangements had to be. By 1977, they had achieved everything they set out to do. They had proven that intelligence and commercialism weren't mutually exclusive, that perfectionism could coexist with accessibility, that two cynical intellectuals from Bard College could top the charts without compromising their vision. But perfection has a price. And that bill was about to come due. The making of Gaucho, Steely Dan's final album of the 1970s, became a 2-year descent into chaos that exposed the fatal flaw in their system: the illusion of absolute control. What began in 1978 as another quest for sonic perfection devolved into what Becker would later describe as an experience that wasn't fun at all. The numbers tell part of the story. 42 different musicians cycled through the sessions. The costs spiraled into the hundreds of thousands. But the real story is what was happening behind the scenes. A perfect storm of legal battles, personal tragedy, and the limits of human endurance. Legally, the album was a nightmare. A three-way battle erupted between MCA, Warner Brothers, and the band over release rights. Later, jazz pianist Keith Jarrett successfully sued them for copyright infringement on the title track, forcing them to concede a co-writing credit. Even the music itself seemed cursed. Dire Straits guitarist Mark Knopfler, recruited to play on Time Out of Mind, compared the recording experience to getting in a swimming pool with lead weights tied to your boots. The exhausting creative suffocation, the endless rejection of takes, the psychological pressure of working for two men whose standards had crossed from demanding into impossible. But the real devastation was personal, and it hit Walter Becker with cruel force. In January 1980, Becker discovered his girlfriend, Karen Stanley, dead of a drug overdose in their Manhattan apartment. The tragedy shattered him. Then Stanley's family filed a massive $17 million lawsuit against him, alleging he was responsible for her death. Though the suit was eventually settled out of court, friends observed that Becker never fully recovered from the emotional devastation. Months later, fate struck again. Becker was hit by a taxi, fracturing his right leg so badly he was immobilized. For weeks, he communicated with Fagen and the engineers only by telephone, physically isolated while trying to complete the most difficult album of their career. And then came the ultimate symbol of their system's collapse, the second arrangement. They had spent weeks perfecting this track. It was nearly complete. The master recording captured something magical, that elusive quality they'd been chasing through hundreds of takes and dozens of musicians. Then an assistant engineer accidentally erased it, the entire master, gone in a moment of human error. They tried to re-record it, but Becker and Fagen felt the subsequent versions failed to capture the original magic. The track was abandoned entirely. When Gaucho finally limped into stores in 1980, it was excellent, because Steely Dan was incapable of releasing anything less than excellent. But everyone involved knew the truth. They had pushed the system past its breaking point. The machine had overheated. Something had to give. After the toxic environment of Gaucho, Becker and Fagen quietly unplugged their partnership. Fagen later described it simply: after 13 years of collaboration, they decided to take a vacation. The breakup was civil, professional, and absolutely necessary. They had nearly destroyed each other in pursuit of perfection. The timing was almost cosmic in its irony. Just as Steely Dan went silent, MTV exploded onto the scene, ushering in an era of visual spectacle and synthesizer-driven pop. The 1980s belonged to artists who looked good on camera, who embraced the new technology, who valued accessibility over complexity. It was the opposite of everything Becker and Fagen represented. Donald Fagen's solo debut, The Nightfly, released in 1982, marked a complete 180-degree emotional shift from the cynicism that defined Steely Dan. Fagen wanted to cleanse himself creatively, moving away from what he called the contemporary dread of their previous work to embrace nostalgia, optimism, and innocence. The album was a song cycle about growing up in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Fallout shelters, the Cuban Revolution, late-night jazz disc jockeys. Fagen stated he wanted it to be a little brighter and a little lighter than a Steely Dan record. I wanted it to be more fun to listen to. He was deliberately moving away from Becker's more detached and biting lyrical edge. But here's what didn't change: the obsessive commitment to sonic craft. The Nightfly maintained the established Steely Dan production quality, retaining producer Gary Katz and engineer Roger Nichols. It was one of the first fully digital recordings, highlighting Fagen's continued pursuit of technical precision. The album proved something crucial: perfectionism could exist without the toxic pressure of the partnership. Fagen had essentially purified the Steely Dan sound, and the public responded. The Nightfly went platinum and earned 7 Grammy nominations. Meanwhile, Walter Becker retreated into a quieter existence. He moved to Hawaii, focused on production work throughout the 1980s and early 90s. New wave bands like China Crisis, artists like Ricky Lee Jones, whose Flying Cowboys album he produced went gold. This period of reclusiveness allowed him to heal from the tragedies surrounding Gaucho, to refine his technical skills away from the creative confrontation with Fagen. The partnership was only dormant, though. They collaborated in 1986 on Rosie Vela's debut album. Becker appeared in Fagen's New York Rock and Soul Review in 1991. These low-pressure collaborations, free from the weight of Steely Dan expectations, laid essential groundwork for what came next. Two old friends finding their way back to each other, not as perfectionists chasing an impossible standard, but as survivors who had learned the price of their ambition. The reunion began quietly in 1993, when Becker and Fagen returned to touring, the very thing they had rejected nearly 2 decades earlier. But the world had changed. Touring logistics had improved, venue acoustics were better, and the financial remuneration, as they diplomatically put it, was too attractive to ignore. More importantly, they'd changed. The pressure was off. They were older, wiser, scarred by tragedy, but also seasoned by experience. They could finally approach touring with the sound quality control they'd previously only achieved in the studio. The full creative return came in 2000 with Two Against Nature, their first new studio album in 20 years. The title itself was perfect, interpreted by many as representing Becker and Fagen as two forces wielding studio perfectionism as a weapon against the forces of chaos and entropy. But the real vindication came later that year when Two Against Nature won the Grammy for Album of the Year. The band that had rejected the traditional rock hierarchy, that had sacrificed years of touring to protect its art, that had been called too smart, too cynical, too detached, they were finally being honored by the mainstream music establishment. The commercial success speaks for itself. Over 40 million albums sold. Their dedication to sophisticated songwriting and high production quality guaranteed enduring relevance. They became a touchstone for the musically minded, their craftsmanship and timelessness ensuring their sound continues to resonate across generations. Walter Becker's death in 2017 brought a definitive end to the core partnership. But the intellectual model they created had proven its worth. By being too smart for the conventional rock world of the 1970s, by rejecting fleeting stardom for eternal, meticulously crafted art, Steely Dan had successfully won the long game on their own terms. Looking back at Steely Dan's journey, you see a story that mirrors a generation of men who built America's engines, companies, and legacies, sometimes losing themselves in the process. Two brilliant outsiders who mastered the rules just to break them, who pursued perfection until it nearly destroyed them, who learned the hard way that control is always an illusion. Their music remains a secret handshake among those who appreciate the craft, the intelligence, the refusal to compromise. In an era of manufactured pop and superficial success, Becker and Fagen proved that quality, divorced from mainstream expectations, sustains. They were too smart for their own good, until that very intelligence became their greatest legacy. What's your favorite Steely Dan song? Leave it in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into music nostalgia.